everyone. I think that we can go ahead and get started. I think a few people are still trickling in, but we want to make sure to respect everyone's time and make sure that we leave plenty of time for what I'm sure is going to be a really wonderful discussion. So my name is Hari Hahn, and I am the director of the SNF Agora Institute, which, for those of you who don't know, is an academic and public forum at Johns Hopkins University that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and inclusive dialogue as a cornerstone of global democracy. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to moderate Faith, Race, and Politics 1 year later. I want to particularly thank Chuck, who you'll meet in just a second, and the Undivided team for partnering with us on this program today. And I want to thank our guests for sharing their precious time with us to participate in this very important conversation. So a year ago, just as our country was headed into a contentious election season, this is in early 2020, we gathered in Cincinnati for a day-long conference to explore what diverse people of faith, civic leaders, and community organizers could learn from each other about the relationship of faith, race, and politics, right? The three things you're not supposed to talk about, we spent a whole day talking about together. And in the year since, I think what we've seen is that faith and race have really been at the forefront of some of the most defining political moments of 2020. From the sweeping protests against racial violence, to the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, to the election of Georgia's first Black senator, Reverend Warnock. And the tensions of faith, race, and politics really exploded at the outset of 2021, as many of you remember, with the insurrection at the US Capitol, cloaked in the language of white Christian nationalism. So we wanted to gather this group here today to ask questions like, what are the prospects for change? Considering our country's deep legacies of racism, what can be done? And what can evangelicals in particular do to confront this difficult moment? So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to be in conversation with our guests today, who are going to help us try to make sense of, I think, this political moment and understand some of these questions. And so I'll start by introducing Kristin Dumay, who can hopefully turn on her screen in just a second. And Kristin is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University and author of a book who has the most amazing title I've ever seen, called Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. We also have with us Chuck Mingo. Chuck is the founder of Undivided, a program that takes participants through life-changing moments of racial healing, and he also serves as a teaching pastor at the Crossroads Church in Ohio. And finally, we have with us Ed Stetzer, who is a professor and the dean at Wheaton College and executive director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Chuck, Kristin, and Ed, for agreeing to be a part of this conversation. So before we dive in, just a few housekeeping notes for everyone. The four of us are going to have a conversation with each other for about 40 minutes. Any time during that conversation, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we'll be trying to answer questions along the way if we can, or we'll have a time specifically for Q&A in the last 20 minutes of our discussion. The chat function has been turned off for comments so that we can use it to share any relevant information from the panelists. And we will be recording today's discussion, and the recorded version will be available on our website and our YouTube channel shortly after the event ends today. So let me start with you, Chuck, if you don't mind. What I'd love to ask you to do is to describe the Undivided journey, because I think it is a particularly unique program focused on racial justice within the church. And so if you could tell us a little bit about the program and how it came about, that would be great.
I would love to do that, and I'm just so happy to be here. So thank you, Hari, and the team at SNF Agora. Just excited to also be with Kristin and Ed for a rich conversation. So Undivided, in simple terms, is a 6-week, like you said, journey. It's a learning experience where we get people into mixed race groups, and we have conversations about race, where we look at history of race in the country. We also look at and train on empathy. We talk about systemic racism and what does that look like? What does that mean? And then we begin to lean into spiritual tools and really talk about what does it look like to have a reckoning around this, to have a sense of resolve to go in a different direction. And really the heart of Undivided is to help people move from a place of perhaps avoidance or maybe isolation into real relationships, and then to catalyze them to be about the work of racial justice. So one of the things we talk about in Undivided is we want people to live undivided after the experience and get into on-ramps where they're actually doing work like tutoring and mentoring, or maybe working on campaigns that are actually changing policy and systemic issues in a city or a context or a community. And so at this point, 7,000 people have experienced Undivided. And right now we are about to launch nationally and engage other churches across the nation in this program. We're excited about that.
And can you tell us a little bit about where it was that you started Undivided, Chuck?
Yes. So Undivided was rooted in the church where I'm still a teaching pastor, Crossroads Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, multi-site church that is predominantly white, but growing in diversity. And specifically the campus where I was a pastor was actually pretty diverse and growing more diverse. And this is in 2015, and the tension points of 2 years removed from Trayvon Martin, and Ferguson had happened the year before. And our country was just once again in this moment of racial tension. Seems like we've never been out of that moment of racial tension, quite frankly. But in that moment, I really just felt amidst our church doing a journey that was really about what's the bold step that God's calling you to take to be a voice in this space. And I said, this isn't just a calling for me, this is us. This is something that our church is to lean into. And over the next year, Undivided was birthed, and literally just hundreds of people that now have become thousands of people have stepped into the space to say, what does it look like to be a follower of Jesus, to be a Christian, but to also have a sense of the biblical call for racial solidarity and justice, and to live that out in everyday ways in our world.
Great. So Kristin and Ed, I'm wondering if I can turn to you and ask you to put this into context a little bit. I mean, I know that when I first learned about Undivided, part of what struck me as so unusual about it is that you have this program of thousands of people going through it, taking place in one of the largest evangelical megachurches in our country. And, you know, for those of us who are political observers, I think a lot of us have looked at the data, you know, and all the stories coming out of the 2020 election that sort of said, you know, that 7 or 8 out of 10 white evangelical voters supported Trump, that, you know, this sort of call for a reckoning around race doesn't seem to be as common within the broader evangelical community. And so I'm wondering if you all would be willing to put that into context for us and where you see this moment in evangelical and particularly white evangelicalism. I don't know.
Yeah.
Kristin, you want to go?
Sure. So I'll start and then turn things over to Ed. You're right. We have this survey data, and none of it looks particularly encouraging when it comes to white evangelicals and an array of views on race and racial justice issues. And yet, when you scratch beneath the surface, it's a complicated story, because I mean, you do have white evangelicals who are racist, actively so, who are actively working to undermine racial justice measures. You have a lot of evangelicals that do not fit in that category at all, who do not feel any personal animosity towards people who are not white, who may have a lot of goodwill and good intentions, who may genuinely want racial unity, but they are coming into this conversation having been deeply formed in a white Christianity. But that's invisible to them, the whiteness is. It's just Christianity and the way that they've been exposed to this. And so many of their values, many of their religious values, things like Christian nationalism, their economic values, political values, they think this is just Christian. But so as a historian, I have a bit of a bias here. I would say when you look to history, that's when you can start to see and identify, oh, actually, this is a pretty distinctive religious tradition, and it's a distinctively white religious tradition. And if we can understand that, then we can open up and have some of these conversations. Like Chuck is doing an amazing job with these conversations, but it can be very hard to have productive conversations if we're actually working from completely different understandings of the past, which then give us completely different understandings of the present.
I think that the milieu in which evangelicalism was birthed and formed certainly shapes its expression today. And I think we talked some with Kristin talking some about the history. Let me affirm that and agree with that, and also say I think that the surprise for a lot of people, and I think Harry, you kind of indicated that, was looking into maybe evangelical conversations. There's a little bit of surprise that these are actually going on, can be very robust. Matter of fact, I'm about to do a 4-part series on just examples like what they're doing in Cincinnati, and they're all over the country. And these are evangelical churches. And I think one of the things that helps, I try to talk about this often with a reporter and to explain that there's different kinds of evangelicalism. And one of the things, I would say grassroots white evangelicalism is descriptively very supportive of former President Trump, tends to be, much more conservative politically. Those are just facts. I mean, you don't have to, math doesn't care about how we feel about it. That's just the math. I'm a pollster by background. But then if you look in terms of grassroots, if you go to grass tops, and I want to be careful with the language, but think about pastors and church leaders. I would say you see a very different conversation among pastors and church leaders where they've been engaged in racial reconciliation conversations. They're learning from others, having conversations like Chuck and Brian have been leading in Cincinnati and more. And, maybe too, when it comes to they've been involved in refugee resettlement in the church. So they have a different feeling towards refugees, or they've maybe been counseling with a family who has immigration issues, have a different feeling towards there. And so I think one of the things you find is that even a conversation like this would very much appeal to a lot of evangelical leaders who are trying to lead congregations to engage these conversations faithfully and fruitfully, ways that make a difference. And they're trying to figure out how, because what's happened is, as I think there was a national conversation opened anew after the killing of George Floyd, and I saw white evangelical engagement at a higher level than I've ever seen it before. Friends of mine, Jamar Tisby's book shoots back to the New York Times bestsellers when it was off the New York Times bestseller list, and lots of others. And then there was a backlash to that, a white lash, if you will, to that no, that's critical race theory. That's intersectionality. And people are like, well, I'm just acknowledging systemic racism. So what I think evangelical leaders, pastors right now are asking is, how do I have this kind of conversation? I recognize the lived experience of my African-American sisters and brothers may be different, not just a binary white and black, but just for this moment, lived experience is different. I have a congregation that maybe is skeptical about these things, would actually see racism as a sin personally, but evangelicals are very much about personal redemption and restoration, wouldn't necessarily see systemic issues in the same way, whereas maybe their pastors and church leaders do. So conversations like this, I think, can help us, and things like what Chuck's doing and leading out can help Christian leaders who want to make this a part of their discipleship, that people would be the kind of Christians who are engaging in personal sin and dealing with personal sin, but also in systemic issues, structures and structural racism that maybe evangelicals have sort of been on the sideline 10 years ago and maybe are more aware of today, at least among pastors, I would say. Again, grassroots, maybe we've got some distance, I think, to go there.
So that's actually, sorry, to me, that is so interesting. I think you were the one that first pointed that data to me, that there's this gap between the views among congregants and the clergy, and I'm reminded of something I read once by Timothy Keller, where he sort of said there's this question of, will the church be a mirror, of society, or will it lead society to where it needs to go? And so, Chuck, I wonder, part of what I think is really interesting about Undivided is that really that 6-week journey that you described is just the beginning, as you said, right? That's a spark that sort of animates people into action in so many different ways that you all have seen, particularly in Ohio, but also in other parts of the country. And what do you think that a program like Undivided does in the context of the gap that Ed was just describing to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ed really describes well some of the challenges that exist within evangelicalism as you think about, and I love your language around the grass tops and grassroots. What Undivided does is it actually creates opportunity for people at the grassroots level to experience and become activated in this space. And I know for me, the things that I have learned most substantially are the things where I've gotten to experience them, where it's not just been, I'm a consumer, but I actually become a contributor. And that's what Undivided really does. And I think that's what's different about the experience in Undivided is we're focused on that. We're catalyzing people into action. We're working on the front end with churches to identify these on-ramps that they can engage into. And I think that learning experience creates fertile ground, if you will, for a pastor who has a vision to take their church somewhere. Because I think Ed identified it very clearly. And I think Kristin would say similarly, to use evangelical language, what we're describing is a gap in how we quote unquote disciple our people, how we form our people spiritually to show up missionally as Jesus in the world. And the way I think about it is this: if I was to go to another country, and many people who are in the evangelical space know this, one of the things I would do is I would quote unquote exegete the culture, which means I would want to understand the culture. I'd want to understand the norms. I'd be looking for something called redemptive analogies, the things that are already in their culture that point to the good news of Jesus. And in America, we've not done that. And we have an incredibly powerful one in the space of the division that exists, the power to see that be reconciled, about the power to see justice reign and roll down like waters. I mean, we think about those Martin Luther King terms. And so I think what Undivided does is hopefully gives those pastors and leaders a tool where they can activate people and it can become part of their spiritual formation.
So Kristin, then I think I want to circle back to something that you said, which is the idea that, if we look at history, then there are a lot of roots that you've written about, that in some ways kind of root some of these legacies of racism and patriarchy in the church. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what those are. And in particular, I know that a lot of people are probably coming to this conversation with, having on their minds January 6th, right, which is this astounding moment of political violence, that was cloaked in the language of Christian nationalism. And so, what is it in the history of white Christianity, that enabled something like that to take root? And maybe this is, we were joking, I will say, for our audience before the panel started, that Kristin's the one who's going to leave blood on the floor. So maybe this is the moment where it all comes out.
Okay, then roll up my sleeves. So Chuck mentioned a problem of discipleship and leadership, and I think that it's important to point out that many white American Christians have been thoroughly discipled, but not necessarily from their pastors. And so they have been discipled by a religious culture. They have been discipled by a Christian media, right, by the Christian publishing industry. And my book actually traces a strand. It's not a book about all of evangelicalism or all of white evangelicalism. It really is tracing the strand of white evangelical masculinity and militarism as they intersect with Christian nationalism and how that has become a dominant strand. But in doing so, I came to understand how an emphasis that can be traced at least as far back as the Cold War, an emphasis on the duty of a Christian man is to be a protector of faith, family, and nation. And in the Cold War context, that was a military protector. It required militancy. And then I kind of trace that through up to the present. But some of the consequences of that are that if you embrace that view of Christian manhood, and then you end up really changing the faith itself, corrupting the faith, you might say, into a kind of us versus them militancy that, and the stakes are always incredibly high, so the ends will always justify the means, and ends up really transforming the gospel of Christ. And it's this kind of transformed Christianity that has been really fed to white evangelicals through Christian radio, through Christian publishing, through televangelism and the like, really for generations now. And it dovetails with a political agenda, and it is very distinctively white. It is consumed by white people, is produced by white people, but it is marketed and sold as just obedient Christianity. And so that is how many people have been formed. And it takes a dismantling of that, a deconstruction really of these ideals to understand, to let people be in a place where they can be discipled, where they can ask, what is the faithful response to the gospel of Christ in this moment?
So I'm curious, Ed, if how I know that you've written on so much on a lot of these topics too, and if you would agree with the analysis, first of all, and second, I guess I'm also curious, why is it that the Christian media outlets trended in that direction, right? Of all the directions they could have gone, as they began to form historically, why would they go in the directions that Kristin is describing to us?
Yeah, and I think I read Kristin's book and agreed with a lot of it. Probably places I would describe things differently, maybe the cause and effect a little differently. I think evangelicalism was formed in a milieu of militant masculinity as well. So there was, which causes which, and she addresses some of that. So that's not like news to her. But it's like, oh well, suddenly the whole thesis of my book is gone just because of Ed's sentence. But I do think there was this sense that, and I do think that that helping our society to address unhealthy aspects of masculinity, particularly in evangelicalism, is a good and a right thing that needs to be done. How to do that, I think Kristin and I would probably debate, a friendly debate between evangelicals. I would say that, though, I think we can see the result of some of that is the protector idea came to its fruition in the presidency of President Trump, where evangelicals felt they had a protector. And having had a protector, they then felt the need to protect. And so you mentioned, of course, the Capitol riot. And I would say that, I wrote an article in USA Today that lit up my mailbox, still does, for that. I called it A Call for an Evangelical Reckoning. And I would say that, again, I'm one who likes to parse things. And I would say that you have to look at evangelicals. White evangelicals are overwhelmingly Republican. Keep in mind, though, a third of people, if you define evangelicals by belief, which is how the National Association of Evangelicals does it, a third of evangelicals actually are people of color. But among white evangelicals, there's a significant correlation. It's not a one-to-one, but there's significant correlation with being Republicans. And so if you take these into concentric circles, right, there's half the country was disappointed in the results of the election, right? So slightly less than half because of our numbers. Of those, at the time, 2/3 think the election was rigged, was stolen somehow, incorrectly, they believe that. And then a subset of them decided to come to Washington and some of them prayed and exercised Christian symbols. And then a subset of them, particularly influenced by, I think, conspiracy theories, QAnon, and the tie to evangelicalism, which is what I've written on before in USA Today as well, about my concerns about conspiracy theories and evangelicalism. And so what I would say is I certainly, I disagree with people who think the election was stolen. I agree with former Attorney General Barr. On that, I disagree with people needed to go to the DC, though I respect their right to do what I would ironically call mostful peaceful protests, because that was something that some of those people mocked in the summer of 2020, because they were indeed mostly peaceful protests then. And then I'm deeply concerned about those who were shaped in a culture that has trafficked in conspiracy theories, including among evangelical leaders, trafficked in conspiracy theories. So I think you have to look at those things differently. I think a lot of evangelicals who are white and who are Republican believe Donald Trump, that the election erroneously believed Donald Trump, the election was stolen. And I support their right to pray and to protest against that. But again, what was festering, and I'll drop in the chat my article in USA. I wrote this article in USA Today about evangelicals need to deal with conspiracy theories and QAnon back before it was cool to talk about it, because I see it in our movement, and these are areas that have to be addressed. And so I would say what Kristin said is that there's a work to be done. I call it a reckoning. There's an evangelical reckoning that needs to be had. I think that most of us on this call would be consistent on most of the things that need to be reckoned with. I think when we get down to some of the details, I think some might say, for example, Kristin might say, well, I think there are 3 or 4 things more that I would want to do. I think we'd probably agree on 15 of them, and maybe the last 4 or 5 to get to the end, we might not be the same place, but maybe we can at least agree on the 10 to 15, because there's work to do in our movement in evangelicalism, and Christian evangelical leaders are going to have to speak up and work towards it.
So I'd love to think about that, because it feels like it's not only, we've been focusing on white evangelicalism, to your point, which is only a small portion of the broader evangelical faith tradition, but it feels like there's this kind of moment of renewal for American churches in general. So even if we think outside of evangelicalism, for moment of churches in general, and there I'm thinking about, Martin Luther King kind of famously talked about the most segregated hour being Sunday morning at 11, and the data doesn't seem to indicate that that's changed all that much, that it's still really a struggle to create multiracial churches. And Chuck, you're a Black pastor in a largely white church. The church, I think, is up to about like 40,000 people, a week. And so it's an enormous mega church. And my understanding also of the data is that the mega church is where the growth really is in a lot of the church movement. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about why has it been so hard for American churches in general, not just evangelical ones, to grapple with this question of building a really multiracial church?
Yeah, I know this may not be the right posture to take in a panel discussion, because you want to answer your questions and be pithy and smart. But you've got Ed Stetzer on the call, and Ed, I really would love for you to answer that question, or at least to frame it for us, Because I do think that just knowing your connection to church planning movements and Exponential and some of the great work that's happening there with Dave Ferguson and that team, like it'd be great to kind of dimensionalize what is happening in the church. And then we can have the conversation, I think, Hari, rightfully around what does that look like in terms of culture and race.
Yeah, Chuck, I'd really like to hear you, but all right, I'll briefly address that. I do think that one of the untold stories, and when I talked to a religion reporter, actually one religion reporter started, one of the untold stories of evangelicalism is its diversification. Yeah. And there has been significant movement on some of these issues, particularly among younger churches. Chuck mentioned church planting. For those of you who are joining us, and that's a strange phrase. It's not related to plants and watering plants at church. It's the starting of new religious communities or congregations. And they're, in most denominations, the Assemblies of God, it's the second largest Protestant denomination in America. The majority of their church plants are non-Anglo. Southern Baptists are the largest. The majority of their church plants are non-Anglo. And you see that now, the LCMS, a significant number. I mean, you see the LCMS, you'd think of a bunch of German Lutherans, and you'd be surprised to find out that when it comes to their church planting, this becomes an area of greater diversity. So what's happening is, and I think one of the reasons that we're even having this conversation, because there's a conversation going on broadly in culture that evangelicals tend not to listen to. Now, I want to explain briefly what I mean. If you go and you look on television and you see leaders having these conversations, evangelicals often discount those people. Well, those people are in the mainstream media or whatever else it may be. And one of the things that's happened is in the last few years is that evangelical leaders, particularly people, Chuck and others, people of color, have spoken up about some of these issues. And the end result is that people are giving it a closer ear. So after Ferguson, one of the things that I did is I recognized that I thought this was a key moment. And so I actually, I have a space at Christianity Today. And as a matter of fact, I think I can share screen. So I'll just show you, because it's going to kind of explain a little bit about why I did it this way. So I invited a series of African-American leaders to a series called It's Time to Listen, listening to African-American evangelicals on race. And then I draw from many African-American leaders that people listen to at conferences, Brian Loritz, Leonce Crump, Philip Fletcher, Lisa Sharon Harper, Stacey Hilliard, Brett Fuller. And I think what would happen, for example, Leonce's question, will white evangelicals ever acknowledge systemic injustice, right? Well, okay, what does that mean? How can we learn from one another? And what I've tried to do is to pass the mic to African-American leaders who many evangelicals in the last 10 years, as evangelicals have diversified their conference platforms, are now hearing from on a regular basis. They say, oh, wait a second. So Leonce Crump, who I heard, Chuck mentioned Exponential, which is very much insider language, Chuck, but it's the largest church planting conference in the world. And Chuck and I regularly go there. But they hear Leonce Crump at Exponential, and then Leonce Crump is saying, hey, my lived experience in engaging the police is different than yours. And it's like, well, wait a second. This isn't somebody on MSNBC. This is somebody on my platform. So whatever you call it, my attempt is to help facilitate that conversation that many pastors and church planners, so Chuck's engaged in that exponential space as well as church planning space. These kind of conversations are very normal in our space. We've had, I lead something called the Church Planting Leadership Fellowship. The heads of church planning from every denomination that does church planting in America comes together twice a year in a private conversation, a private meeting. And we've had conversations about multiracial churches, about African-American churches, about how to listen and learn from one another. So this is a space that's having that conversation already. And ultimately, for me, having evangelical leaders speak into evangelical context, and Harry, I mean, clearly by you engaging Undivided and Chuck and others, that's the kind of conversation that, for good or for ill, and maybe it's not just us. I'm guessing Jewish leaders are more likely to hear from Jewish leaders, and I'm guessing Muslim leaders are more likely to hear from Muslim leaders. So people hear from people trusted in their tradition. And we've got some good leaders and thinkers who are helping us think through some of these things as our tradition. Now, Chuck, have I framed your answer enough? Because I feel like you threw that to me. All right, go ahead. Now back to Chuck.
Chuck,
you have, and just to pick up there, and I think, to the point that Ed's making, the church is changing in America. Whether we want to embrace it or not, it is changing because society is changing. And so the thing that is needed and the opportunity that exists is, how do you take pastors who are in those conferences and equip them with tools that ultimately translate to congregations, and ultimately translate to small groups. A lot of churches in the evangelical space, the kind of primary unit of learning is, a group of 8 to 10 people who commit to, whether it be for a couple weeks or longer, to journey together, to grow spiritually together. And that's what ultimately is needed for this to kind of, again, that grassroots, grass tops. How do you bring those together? And I think that's, again, the space where Undivided really wants to step in. So I think, Hari, to the question that you're asking, there's a tremendous moment that we're in. I call it a moment of liminality. I talked about this yesterday. Liminality is that in-between space in a story. I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. And so for people who listen to Lord of the Rings or watch Lord of the Rings, it's like 8 hours and 56 minutes of the entire 9-hour trilogy is liminality. And I think the church is in a liminal space. And it's a space where, to what Ed said, are we going to listen only to those voices of color, or are we going to start to respond and act differently, because leadership is coming from different places and different faces in the evangelical movement in this moment?
So we're starting to get a lot of questions from the audience. And so I want to go ahead and bring some of those questions into our conversation. And so there's one specifically for you, Kristin. So maybe I'll turn to that first, if that's okay. So this is a question from Reverend Kobe Little, who's a prominent leader in Baltimore here, who I've learned a lot from. And he said he wants to interrogate the term protector that you use in referring to work where, and as he writes, it says, it seems to infer that the intent of the actor comes from a healthy and wholesome place, even if the outcome or impact is unhealthy. And, so is that the right word, or words like warrior or conqueror or leader or crusader or something like that? And is curious, to hear you reflect on sort of what the relationship is between the language that you chose to use in describing the phenomenon and the research.
I love that question. And so that if it were in writing, it would have had little scare quotes around it, right? This protector
it has
language.
Quotes around protector, yes.
Right. So I was using their language. And when you go back to mid-century, when, this is the era of the founding of the National Association of Evangelicals. This is really when they're coming into their own. This is the Billy Graham years, and kind of coalescing around a particular identity. Christian nationalism was very much a part of that, defending Christian America against the communists. It was a very real and present danger. And gender traditionalism was a part of this identity, gender difference. And this is where the masculine protector really was elevated as the God-ordained role, and to protect vulnerable women and children. And so very distinct roles. And that language of protector is just ubiquitous. And then, yes, that can be morphed. It can mean many different things.
Yeah.
And what we see over the course of the rest of the 20th century is, it gets caught up in, military defense. Vietnam is a critical moment. And then it gets caught up again in post 9/11. Anti-Islam. And by that time, it really has morphed. It's interchangeable with warrior. So a crusader pops up some, but really this warrior motif. And you also have cowboys thrown in, and you've got, soldiers thrown in, and it does have this very militant baggage that it carries. But yet the protector language persists. And that's exactly how it works, because what could possibly be wrong with protection, right? It does seem so good and necessary. And yet when it becomes merged with warrior, and, this ends justify the means mentality, then it can in fact do all kinds of harm.
That's interesting. And hence also leads to your title about John Wayne, who sort of fits into that mold of protector and cowboy and all the things that you've just described to us about Jesus and John Wayne. Sorry.
Right, exactly. And so that's, one more thought on the John Wayne and the role that kind of he plays in this story is what ends up happening is the strongest protectors, the men who are not emasculated, who have not been feminized through, all the terrible things that have happened with the rise of feminism and liberalism and secular humanism and so on. The men who are most untainted by these bad things are also the men who have not been deeply formed through Christian virtue, like the fruit of the Spirit or the Beatitudes or so on. And that's why repeatedly in the literature on Christian manhood, I saw that they were going outside of Christian tradition to find their heroes, to find their masculine ideals. John Wayne is a great example of that. I mean, you can find many. Mel Gibson's William Wallace is a favorite example, and then ultimately Donald Trump as well.
That's so interesting. So I'm going to keep moving through the questions. So we had a couple questions. Maybe Chuck, I'll ask you to start with this, and anyone else who wants to jump in, obviously, on all of this. A couple of people have asked about the connection between white Christian nationalism, or the kind of white evangelical church in general, and white supremacy. And like, I think, one person sort of asked, or what is that connection, and are we feeding into the disconnect between our nation's original sin and white evangelicalism? Someone else asked what we think as the biggest factors are contributing to white evangelicals' inability to see white supremacy for what it is. And so I'm curious, Chuck, how you all think about that and talk about that within Undivided, because I know you guys have thought about that a lot.
Yeah, so it's a great question and a very complex question. So I'm going to defer. No, I'm not going to defer. Defer to Kristin on this one. No, I do think that one of the things that, and this is just my definition of the term, I think when people use the term white supremacy, it's really important to help understand it and give it some context. Here's my definition. When I think about it, I am not thinking about Charlottesville. I am not thinking about those people who marched and said, "You will not replace us" in 2016. That's not who I'm thinking about. Now, is that white supremacy? Yeah, but it's the extreme. And what I would say is this: white supremacy is woven into, it's invisible. It's woven into every aspect of what it means to be an American. And it is the preference that is given to those who are from European descent. That preference is in our documents. That preference is in our education system. That preference is in our medical system. That preference is in all kinds of ways played into our culture. And so for me, I think that's the starting point we have to recognize, is that white supremacy is really an ideal that's baked into what it means to be American, and it is invisible primarily to those who benefit from it. So that's what I would start with as a definition of white supremacy. And so then I think about what Kristin said earlier. If not examined, how could the American church not become a mirror of that, if that's the milieu in which it was birthed? And I think that's what I think about with white supremacy. So I do think that part of it is, as again, we think about that personal Christianity that Ed talked about, right? Mm-hmm. Personal sin. I'm not going to show up in Charlottesville. Well, guess what? I used to often say this, and it's not really helpful, so I stopped saying it. But I used to say, "Hi, my name is Chuck, and I'm a white supremacist." How could I not be? I was formed in America. How can I not be? You ask me who are the most famous presidents. You ask me who are the great military leaders of our country. You ask me who are the great educators in our country. And I'm probably going to think of a white person first, because that's the way I've been formed and shaped as an American. And so I think the church has to examine the ways in which we have bought into that broader milieu of white supremacy.
Yeah, I think I agree with so much, Chuck, even in what you said. I would say the challenge is that when we begin to use the terms white supremacy in the way that's now commonly accepted in the academic environment, where Kristin and I and Harry work, and then you try to have a conversation in a congregation, and they hear white supremacy as Charlottesville, and and sometimes you have to be careful, reframing language. We all saw a prominent pastor try that and try to reframe the phrase white privilege around white blessing, and that didn't go so well. And yet at the same time, white normativity is, all of us would say that is obvious and evident. I think the challenge is that even here, you started and said, Chuck said, this is the starting point. You're right, but that's not where like 90% of evangelical churchgoers would be when they hear the phrase white supremacy. So here's where it gets tricky. We're trying to have conversations, and again, Chuck, you're successfully leading them, so it's not like a critique of your conversation, but most of the people who are watching are probably in academia. And of course, you hear Chuck say white supremacy, you're like, yeah, it's the systems and structures that are inherent, and we all, and that's not what normal people hear. And so the question is, how do you get even to, because they're saying, I'm not a white supremacist, but Chuck tried to alleviate or take them off guard by saying, Chuck saying I'm a white supremacist. Okay. But what I would say is, this is where it gets tricky, is you have to be able to have some conversation. So when I talk about explaining white privilege, I might even start with Macintosh's invisible knapsack and say, let's talk about some of the things I have as a white man. But by the time I get to the word, maybe they're all like, yeah, I could see that. My experience going into a store at night wearing a hoodie is different than if someone is a person of color. I could see that. And then I say, well, that's called white privilege. So that's where it's tricky, is it's not just analyzing these things in academic environments, which at least three of us on this are, Chuck. I know you're a church environment, but I'm interested. I know I'm asking you a question, Chuck. So here you're standing in Cincinnati, is not exactly, you know, a bastion of Northern progressivism. I mean, Cincinnati, Mark Twain once said that when the end of the world comes, he wanted to be in Cincinnati because it was 20 years behind everywhere else.
Only
So,
10, Ed. It was only 10 years.
Because I was a 10. I'm sorry. I don't want to judge.
10 years.
I love Cincinnati. I'm just quoting Twain, you know, Samuel Clemens. So here's my question. I mean, that phrase that you describe, white supremacy, would be something that at Calvin, Johns Hopkins, and Wheaton, we'd have internal academic conversations about. Is that something that you stand in front of a congregation and say, and if so, how do you walk people through that?
Yeah. And the answer is, that's exactly why we built Undivided. And I'm not trying to promote it, but just to say,
No, for sure.
But it has to happen in a smaller context.
Oh, it's not Sunday morning. You're not a stand-up Sunday morning and say, let me tell you what's, okay. So
because to your point, again, unless that's the whole thing I want to spend 35 minutes on, because it's such a long walk, right? To get people, and then they're thinking, well, what about this? And what about that? And these are the kinds of things, though, that we don't disciple around, we don't form around. So I agree with you. It can't be from a stage, which is one of the reasons why pastors need tools to be able to have these conversations, because they need ways to do it. And we've got something called the advantage game that we do in Undivided. We've got ways that create an experience and then an opportunity to discuss that help people kind of discover these things on their own.
So one thing I'll add into this question. Oh, Kristin, do you want to go in? You should go.
Well, I just wanted to jump in too a little bit in terms of how it's absolutely right to place white evangelicalism within, you know, broader American traditions of white supremacy. At the same time, I'm going to push back a little bit against that too, because white evangelicals, white Christians, let's say, have helped construct the systems of white supremacy and the traditions that we find ourselves in, often very actively. And so I'm pointing to Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise. I'm pointing to Robert Jones's White Too Long, and many other books out there that demonstrate how this happens. And so it's not just white evangelicals who happen to be Americans and therefore they have this. And then now let's go back and talk about all the lovely things about white evangelicalism in an ideal form. That's not historically accurate. And so white evangelicals have actively created and perpetuated systems and ideologies of white supremacy. And that's how we end up with survey data that demonstrates that white evangelicals are more racist, are more likely to hold, views on an array of issues. And so we need to place them in historical context, but also acknowledge agency.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful, Kristin.
Really
yeah. So one thing I was going to plug into this conversation, and then I actually I think a lot of questions are starting to come in about okay, so what do we do? So I want to kind of pivot us a little bit to that conversation. But one thing I just want to say, add to some of the points that you were making about the importance of speaking, meeting people where they are, and also having people who they trust speak to them about, issues that are challenging is, completely consistent with so much of the data that we've seen just on disinformation in general, is that the worst thing you can do when someone is being led down a path of disinformation is to throw more data at them, telling them how they're wrong, right? Because all it does is it causes people to retrench defensively into their pre-existing position. It's not convincing at all. But then if you have someone who I trust come and say, hey, I've got a different experience of this, I have a different view of this, and let me lead you down that path. It's a very different experience, Ed, in the way that you're describing. So just to reinforce that. And so to that point, a couple of the questions that we're starting to get come from people that are sort of thinking about this gap that we talked about before between kind of clergy and congregants on where they are in terms of wanting to confront and grapple with issues of race. And so, one person kind of asked, how does that split relate to things like the fear of the purse among pastors? That what's holding pastors back from being able to go where they feel like they want to go, but they can't. And Chuck or Ed or Chris, I don't know who wants to dive into that, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I can tell you that it certainly is an impact. It's a decision that we all need to make. My public stands have cost me donors, and certainly even in the USA Today article that I posted earlier, I wrote in there, it's cost me personally and professionally to be a person who's called out some of these evangelical kind of, again, I probably maybe am different than a lot of the people who are listening, is that I'm talking about those who were full-throated, all in. I'm not talking to the people who made a difficult decision and might have made a difficult decision that I made in a voting booth, but And there were some like that. There were a lot like that, but there were a whole lot that weren't like that, who kind of bought into the protector, you know, the Cyrus strangeness, you know, those kinds of things. There's a biblical reference to someone who's going to protect the people of God. So, you know, I would say this. One of the things that I'm very careful to say to pastors and church leaders, and Chuck has heard me say this in different places, is don't do what I do on this. Do what I say, in the sense that or not what I say, but just what's best judgment for you. My point is so I'm part of my job is I'm a public commentator. So I write, you know, I publish, you know, 5,000 words a week in different articles and guests at Christianity Today. I have a national radio show. I do those things, right? Podcasts, all that sort of stuff. So, so I would say that if a pastor spent all their time, you know, doing podcasts, you know, I talked to Francis Collins last week about the vaccine, and so many people are mad about that. I'm like, you know, and you know, part of that is my job is can't stop, won't stop. I'm gonna be helping people to think through some of these things. And you know, I posted my parents got the vaccine. I posted that on my Facebook page, and you know, 300 comments later of all the bizarre stuff. You know, I had to take that, you know, to block some of those people. But my point is that I don't think that's a pastor's job. The question is, how much of the job is the pastor's job, right? So it's not, you could easily say, and too many said, as a matter of fact, I would say Mr. Graham regretted saying more of, well, I'm going to focus on, you know, he regretted not being at Selma. He regretted not being at the March on Washington. Said one of his great regrets. So it's, you know, and I had a great conversation with Jamar Tisby on one of the Stetzer Leadership podcasts, and you know, and it really encourages me. I don't want to have that regret. So how much should a pastor and leader speak up and speak out? And I would say on defining issues of our day, such as issues of racial injustice, I think that's an appropriate place and space. That doesn't mean that I'm doing 48 of my 52 Sundays a year, I'm doing sermons on that. But I think ultimately that on this issue, we got to be there. I think on issues of right now, conspiracy theories, I think pastors got to they'll pay some price for talking about some of these things. But I think ultimately we got to disciple this out of people. I think when things are unhealthy and impacting both the body, inside our evangelical language for the church, not just evangelical, but the body, and also impacting our public witness, those are areas that I think we need to address. So I'm not a community organizer if I'm a pastor. You know, I'm not a full-time social justice advocate, but there's got to be place and space for that. And I would say, particularly if you were on the sidelines after Ferguson, which you know, maybe people are like a little hesitant. I saw a lot of evangelical pastors take steps forward in a positive way after George Floyd. And what I would say is, if they can just press through the backlash, they need tools to press through the backlash, because it's constant. You know, I mean, literally every time I talk about systemic racism, it's critical race theory somebody posts, and sometimes I don't respond to tweets anymore, but I want to respond back to it. Could you just define that for me? If you could just define that for me, let me know if I'm against what you think I'm against, or if I'm for what you think I'm for. Because I know that it's just now the new boogeyman. I shouldn't say that. It's not just now the boogeyman. There's genuine debates to be had. But for so many people who are tweeting at me, it's just something they've heard and they think that's systemic racism. So I would say is pastors need courage, and there is a cost. And I would have said, I've often, as a trainer of pastors and leaders, I often have a phrase I use: if 5% of your church isn't mad at you, you're probably not doing anything. And then I would often follow with the joke, and everyone would laugh. But if 70% is mad at you, you might need to tone it down a little bit. Well, what I would say is that in the current culture we're in, with the division we're in, it might be 20 to 25% of your church mad at you at a given time. And that's going to be leadership probably for the next 4 or 5 years. You know, David Brooks has, I thought, this helpful column, and every 60 years, there's this rethink and re-questioning and reestablishment and tearing down of authority structures and engagement of new ones. If that's where we're at, we got a 3 or 4 year time when pastors are going to need greater resilience and courage. And there'll probably going to be some loss in what they're going to lead through, because some people are just not going to go with them on their journey. Take as many as you can, try to build those bridges. And but again, it's a tricky time. It's going to take courage, and it's going to have cost.
Chuck, do you want to add anything, or I'll just there's another question that's kind of related that maybe I'll sort of throw into the mix, which is what would you recommend for groups that are trying to engage in conversations around race? And there's a little bit of follow-up that, it seems like a lot of evangelicals avoid those conversations because they're uncomfortable, or it can lead to dissent in the ways, the 5% or the 20% or the 70%, in different churches, it could be different. And so, if you had any thoughts on people who might be thinking about this work in their own communities.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'd recommend reach out to us, undivided.com. But here's what I would say. I think Ed put it really well. This moment that we're in, if you are evangelical and want to be in this space, it's about courageous love. I've been going back and rereading Martin Luther King's Strength to Love. If I could recommend a book for you to put on your Black History Month reading list, it's a series of his sermons, read that one. He talks about in that book that love is the greatest power in the universe. And he also talks about the cost of that love. And he says, one of the things he says is, if they take you to jail, you should dignify the jail with your presence there. And I think we're in a moment right now. And I think about, Kristin, what you said. I mean, and again, I don't want to talk insidery only, but if we think about Jesus as the hero, Jesus is very clear about how you show up in a moment like this. Yes. And he says, take up your cross, take up your instrument of execution, and follow me. Now, I'm not saying that that's exciting. That's certainly, man, but that's the hero that we follow. And so I do think there needs to be this tension that we live in right now that says, for something greater, there's a cost right now, and it's worth it. And we shouldn't want to build walls. We should want to build bridges, but we can't build bridges if we're not honest about where we really are and where we really stand.
And I would say too, so I'm not a pastor, although I've talked with a lot of pastors, and a couple thoughts. One is that I hear many pastors not worried about their paychecks, or at least not voicing that. And I think genuinely that's not their primary concern, but they worry about their inability that they would lose the ability to minister to this community, right? And thinking, well, if I'm gone, then what? My sense is that many may have erred a little bit too much on that side in past years, and restrained themselves and haven't spoken into the previous moments, which have led us to this moment. But I would also say this is not just a challenge for pastors. This is a challenge for every single one of us, and the costs can be different. If you work for a Christian organization, it could be losing your job, losing your subscribers, losing your donors, but there are often steep family costs that people pay, and severing relationships in churches, in schools, in neighborhoods. Right now, I mean, anybody who's close to evangelicalism is aware of this. This is a fraught moment, and it's easier not to say anything. It's easier to just go quiet. But it's precisely this complicity, I think, that we need to all examine, and to hold love and courage together, like Chuck said, is absolutely critical. And what I will say is, when you do that, you find each other. And so there is community on the other side as well.
That's great, Kristin. And so maybe I can sort of, we still have some other questions that unfortunately we didn't have time for, but I know, Kristin, that you're in such high demand that you're jumping from one Zoom to another. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And maybe the final question that I'd love for everyone to just kind of go around is, so as we think about just the enormity of the challenges that we're facing, both as we think about the relationship of race and politics in our society, but then also particularly race and its rootedness in the church and the challenges for churches and pastors and congregants and just everyone who's part of it, where are each of you drawing your hope as you think about it? Maybe we can kind of end with a few thoughts on where you all see hope. And so, Ed, maybe I'll turn to you first, and then
Sure.
Chuck.
Yeah, I would say that one of the parts of the understanding of the evangelical faith and tradition is the idea of eternity. And this is, because I know people will be watching from different settings and have different faiths or no faith for that matter. And what I would say is, we actually think that there's this picture of eternity in Revelation chapter 7, where men and women from every tongue, tribe, and nation are gathered around the throne forever. And in their eternal state, their ethnicity is still identifiable. It actually says men and women from every tongue, tribe, and nation. So If you want to understand a bit about evangelicals and why this is an area that some evangelical leaders think is important, it actually has to do with eschatology, what it looks like forever. And part of what it looks like forever is a diverse, multifaceted expression, praising and worshiping the God together. If I say to people, if you don't like a multicultural church, I'll say to them, you're really going to hate heaven. And people, will kind of chuckle and laugh, but it makes an important truth. Is that if we ultimately can't see a thread throughout Scripture that values people of different cultures and backgrounds, we're not paying attention. When we do pay attention, I think it speaks prophetically, maybe to the evangelical movement in America this day, and that perhaps that's part of what we need, is a view of the kingdom of God that causes us to build those kinds of bridges. So just remember that for evangelicals, there's always going to be a very religious motivation that's there, and that's going to be a part of who we are bringing it to the conversation.
Thank you. Kristin?
So my hope is drawn at the moment in an earthly sense from seeing so many individual acts of courage, and I draw strength from each and every one. Also from the grace that so many people of color have shown, so many of us in this journey. I think that there's sometimes critics will talk about things like white guilt, or, like this is also negative, and it's just so, like give us a break. And that's actually absolutely not been my experience in being a part of this conversation to any extent. It really is a community of joy. And I think of, historically the sense of beloved community. And that's really what you step into when you start to take steps in this direction. And so there's a lot of hope there. Then ultimately, I think my hope as a practicing Christian comes from a conviction that ultimately, God does not need our protection. And so we're trying to be faithful, but just lighten up a little bit. Like the Christianity and God's truth does not depend on us. So we're trying to do our best, but place that in God's hands.
Thank you. And Chuck, I'll give you the final word.
Thank you. Well, the first word I would say is, and the church says amen. So to what Kristin and Ed have said, amen. So be it, and may that be a place of hope for us. I find my hope in this present moment in two numbers. So I'll give you two numbers. The first is 170 or 171, if I'm counting correctly, people who right now are hanging out on a Wednesday afternoon having a conversation about this. And so for every person who is plugged in and connected, it says something that you would say, hey, I'm here to have this conversation and see it go forward. And the other number that gives me hope is 58. Hari, you know that in the last week and next week, we're going to kind of symbolize it. We have 58 facilitators who we've just launched into the Living Undivided work. Most of them are not pastors. They are people who are everyday folks that have jobs or stay at home or do whatever they do. And yet they're coming together across all racial lines to say, we want to be advocates and we want to be leaders in this space. And that gives me hope that there are people who are willing to step into this moment with courageous love. And I just believe, like Martin Luther King said, that love is the greatest and most powerful force in the universe, and that it actually is the work of God when we do the work of love.
Well, thank you, Chuck, for that. It's a lovely note to end on. And thank you, Ed and Kristin, who I know had to jump off, for such a great discussion. We want to thank, we at the SNF Agora Institute want to thank Undivided for co-hosting today's conversation. And if you want to learn more about their work, we're posting a link to their site in the chat box right now. And thank you to the audience, as Chuck said, for spending this hour with us, for tuning in, for asking such great questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. For all of you, we would love to also note that SNF Agora is hosting several events in the coming weeks. Tomorrow at 11 a.m., we're going to have a conversation called Restoring the Guardrails, which is an event co-hosted with the National Constitution Center, focusing on ways to strengthen American constitutional democracy structurally and normatively against future threats and insurrections. We'll have SNF Agora Senior Fellow Ann Applebaum, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist George Will, and Daniel Ziblatt, co-author of How Democracies Die. And later this month, we're going to start hosting the first event in our new Democratic Spaces series, in which we consider how we can cultivate real and virtual spaces that enable the kind of participation that we want in our democracy. Our first discussion in that series will be on February 23rd, and it's called Disability, Access, and Advocacy. And we'll talk with the director of the Johns Hopkins Disability Health Research Center and creators of Crypt the Vote about how we can ensure that members of the disabled community have full access to participate in our public life. Information about all of our events can be found at our website, which is snfagora.jhu.edu. And you can also sign up for our bi-monthly e-newsletter by clicking on that link. where we'll also post a recording of today's conversation on that website. So please do share it with others. So thank you again for spending an hour with us today. Thank you, Chuck and Ed, once again for your time and all your valuable insights. And look forward to continuing the conversation in other ways, I hope. See y'all later.